We are now in Desjardins chapter 3 on social responsibility, and we're doing the second aspect of that chapter. And in the second chapter, we're going to look at the criticisms of the utilitarian and Kantian arguments. For that, standard economic model passes the utilitarian and Kantian moral tests and is, in fact, a social responsibility model. Right? All right, let's look at the criticisms. Criticism one of the utilitarian argument for the standard economic model and Walmart as socially responsible. Let's call it the internal utilitarian criticism. That is to say that the standard economic model does not do as well as it thinks, or as it may seem, even by the utilitarian standards. So the internal utilitarian criticism of the standard economic model would claim that firms like Walmart do not maximize utility because the benefits are not quite as large as it would seem, and the harms are also greater than it would seem. Here are some of the reasons. The benefits are not as large because it may not be the case that the happiness of consumers is significantly raised because they are consuming. Consumers frequently purchase trivial things, and their happiness goes up only marginally, if at all. Money spent may not be a good indicator of happiness gained. In other words, just because people are buying Walmart items does not mean that their happiness is going up. Right? I've made plenty of purchases that did not actually raise my happiness in my life. Sometimes I buy silly things that are just distractions and do not raise my happiness. So it's not clear that the happiness of consumers automatically goes up just because they get to buy more products from Walmart. Second thought here is that the harms are also larger than it would seem because profit maximization encourages negative externalities. It maximizes profits to pass as many of the costs onto third parties as possible. One example of that is pollution, that firms have an incentive not to spend money on cleaning up or limiting. The point here is this. If our goal is to maximize profits, then we want to reduce costs as much as possible. And one way to reduce costs is to pass those costs onto someone else, thus creating negative externalities. A good example of that is something like pollution. It would certainly increase the costs of a company if it cleaned up the pollution that it produces and thus lower its profits. So that is to say that the standard economic model encourages companies to engage in negative externalities so long as they're not breaking the law. And we know that the law is not perfect, and that the law is frequently slow. So wouldn't we want company leaders to thoughtfully refuse to engage in negative externalities? Standard economic model encourages the leaders to pursue negative externalities because that maximizes the profits to the firm. Standard economic model would reply that the best way to handle the problem of negative externalities is to pass laws that make that kind of an activity illegal. However, laws are passed after the damage is done. That is called the first generation problem, right? Laws to limit various negative externalities are passed after negative externalities have been undertaken and have done their damage. Furthermore, firms hire all kinds of lobbyists to shape laws in their favor. And that would be legitimate and even encouraged by the standard economic model. So, in the final analysis, it just doesn't seem, it may not be the case that the standard economic model maximizes benefits quite as much as it would seem, and it seems that it may produce quite significant harms through negative externalities, or perhaps even through low wages that firms are thus encouraged to pay to their employees. Again, in order to reduce costs and in order to maximize profits. All right. Criticism one of the Kantian argument for that the standard economic model and Walmart are socially responsible. This will be an internal Kantian criticism. We remember the Kantian argument for the standard economic model. Firms are owned by their shareholders, and shareholders are in the game of owning the firms in order to maximize profits, and their will should be done. Otherwise, their autonomy as owners would be violated. Right? That kind of a Kantian argument. All right, so let us look at the criticism of it. The argument of this criticism is that shareholders are not actually owners, but are rather more like clients in relation to the firm. That is because, unlike owners who have their whole livelihood in the firm, shareholders have limited liability. Owners put up a large amount of funds to run a firm and are personally responsible for any debts that a firm incurs. Whereas investors that are shareholders can invest as little as they like and can lose only what they invest. An investor can also pull their funds from a firm in a matter of seconds, whereas an owner would not spend a long time, would have to spend a long time looking for a buyer. So, in all of the above senses, investors are more like clients who lend their capital to the firm and are owed no more than a competitive rate of return, and certainly are not owed a maximization of returns at all costs. So basically, the thought here is doesn't make sense to think of shareholders as owners of the firm. Owners of firms usually have their whole livelihoods invested in them, whereas shareholders can invest as little as they wish, right? You can just buy a single share in a firm. And a wise investor would really not be looking at shareholding as a main source of income. They would not put their house up for mortgage in order to become shareholders in companies. Whereas an owner might do that sort of a thing for their company. And so it doesn't make sense to treat shareholders in the same way as it would to treat owners, right? So the argument here is that shareholders should be given exactly the same status as all other people participating and affected by the actions of the firm. It's not clear that they should be given privilege over everyone else. And if that's the case, then it's not so obvious that their autonomy is violated when firms are not operated solely to maximize profits, but may have other moral concerns. Um, the other argument here is that ownership of property does not simply entitle one to do as one wishes with the property if one's use of it harms others. Right. Even owners really cannot run their firm in such a way that harms employees or clients or whoever else. All of that is just to say that, all right, so even if we do think of shareholders as owners of firms, we're not just to unconditionally do whatever they wish. We have to look at the other factors that are involved. Criticism two of the Kantian argument. The criticism here is that autonomy or freedom of employees is not respected by paying them very low wages and keeping many of them on part-time basis in order not to pay their health, retirement, and other benefits, something Walmart has been guilty of. Person needs a certain minimal amount of funds, health, leisure time, etc., in order to make informed, rational judgments for oneself. A person who sleeps little, worries about funds for basic nutrition, health, and other needs, has little time off from work in order to make their ends meet. And they likewise have little ability to make rational, informed judgment for themselves. That is to say, the argument here is if, say, in maximizing profits, low wages are paid to the employees in the firm, as in the case of Walmart, the autonomy of employees is not respected. They're not they're put into a position in which they're not capable of making autonomous, rational judgments. If they're too exhausted to clearly think about their decisions, if they're too exhausted to gather information to make informed judgments, and if they're just worried about making ends meet, that's really survival and not autonomy. All right, so we have looked at the utilitarian and Kantian criticisms of the Kantian and utilitarian arguments for that standard economic model is moral and therefore is socially responsible. We're going to look at other uh, social responsibility models next.